He thought she had fallen off the map. He had no idea she was about to land above his entire world. The private terminal at Westbridge International Airport shimmered under the late afternoon sun, its glass walls catching streaks of gold that reflected off polished marble floors and chrome railings, everything pristine, controlled, expensive, just the way Ryan Whitmore liked it. He stood near the VIP lounge entrance, one hand casually tucked into the pocket of his tailored navy suit, the other holding his phone as if the entire space answered to him, which, in many ways, it did. Conversations hummed in low, confident tones around him, the kind of quiet power only money could buy, punctuated by the distant echo of rolling carry-ons and the occasional announcement drifting through the air like background music no one really listened to. Ryan wasn't supposed to notice her. She was just another traveler stepping out of the crowd beyond the glass doors that separated commercial passengers from the curated calm of private aviation. But something about the way she moved, unhurried, grounded, almost invisible, caught his attention. She wore a simple beige coat, the kind you'd find in any mid-range department store, her hair pulled back in a low, practical tie, no statement jewelry, no designer flash, nothing that demanded a second glance. And yet, he looked twice. Then a third time. His breath didn't hitch. His heart didn't race. It was something quieter, colder. Recognition. Evelyn Carter. The name settled in his mind like a fact he hadn't needed to remember until now. For a moment, he simply watched her. She pulled a modest carry-on behind her, the wheels clicking softly against the polished floor, her posture straight but unassuming, like someone who had learned how to take up less space in a world that once revolved around her. 5 years. That was how long it had been since he had last seen her in person, 5 years since the divorce that had felt less like an ending and more like a correction, a necessary adjustment to a life that had outgrown her. At least, that's what he had told himself. He remembered the version of Evelyn who used to stand beside him at charity galas, dressed in gowns that cost more than most people's monthly rent, smiling just enough to be noticed but never enough to outshine him. He remembered how easily she had blended into his world, how quietly she had supported it, how replaceable that had all felt in the end. And now here she was, standing just beyond the threshold of a world she clearly didn't belong to anymore. Or so he thought. A faint smirk touched the corner of his lips, subtle, almost polite, the kind of expression that passed for empathy in circles like his. He shifted his weight, straightened his jacket slightly, and stepped forward, closing the distance between them with the confidence of a man who believed he already knew the outcome of every interaction. "Evelyn," he called, his voice smooth, measured, carrying just enough warmth to sound civil. She paused. Not abruptly. Not startled. Just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him. Then she turned. And for a fraction of a second, something in her gaze didn't match the story he had already written for her. But it was gone before he could name it. "Ryan," she said, her voice even, calm, untouched by surprise. He let out a soft breath, almost a chuckle. "I wasn't sure it was you," he said, his eyes scanning her again, taking in the coat, the bag, the absence of anything that signaled success. "How have you been?" It sounded like concern. It wasn't. It was assessment. A quiet measurement of how far she had fallen. Around them, the airport continued its silent choreography of wealth and movement, unaware that in the middle of it stood a man convinced he was witnessing the aftermath of someone else's failure. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, her expression unreadable, her stillness almost deliberate. And then, very slightly, she smiled. Not the kind of smile he remembered. Not soft, not accommodating, not seeking approval. This one was quieter. Steadier. As if she knew something he didn't. And for the first time since he had recognized her, Ryan Whitmore felt something shift, small, almost imperceptible, like the faintest crack in a certainty he had never thought to question. Ryan let the silence stretch just long enough to feel intentional, his gaze still resting on Evelyn as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of the same person, the one he had left behind and the one standing in front of him now, stripped of everything that once defined her in his world. He tilted his head slightly, offering. A small, practiced smile that had once opened doors and closed arguments, the kind of expression that suggested he was being generous simply by acknowledging her. "It has been a while," he said, his tone light, almost conversational, as if they were old acquaintances rather than people who had once shared a life built on promises that no longer existed. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the handle of her carry-on, the motion subtle, controlled, her posture never faltering. Up close, there were details he had not noticed from a distance. Her coat was simple, yes, but clean, well-fitted, intentional. Her shoes were not designer, but they were polished, practical, chosen with purpose. There was no trace of carelessness, no sign of someone unraveling. And yet, to Ryan, it still translated into something else entirely. Simplicity. Reduction. A step down from the life she once had. "I heard you stayed in the area," he continued, his voice carrying a faint edge of curiosity masked as politeness. "Doing something smaller these days." The pause before the last words was almost imperceptible, but it was there, carefully placed, like a pin in a map marking where he believed she had landed. Around them, a pair of executives walked past in low conversation, their tailored suits and polished shoes reinforcing the unspoken hierarchy of the space. Ryan did not look at them. He did not need to. He belonged here. That certainty sat in his shoulders, in the way he stood, in the quiet assumption that everyone else would eventually move around him. Evelyn met his eyes, and for a moment, she said nothing. The noise of the terminal seemed to soften, the distant announcements fading into a blur as if the world itself had stepped back to watch the exchange unfold. "I have been working," she said finally, her voice steady, neutral, offering nothing more than the words themselves. No explanation. No defense. No invitation for further questions. Ryan let out a soft breath through his nose, almost amused, as if her answer had confirmed something he had already decided was true. "I am glad to hear that," he replied, nodding once, his expression settling into something that resembled approval. "It is important to stay grounded." The word lingered in the air, wrapped in a meaning that went far beyond its surface. Grounded, as in close to the ground. Close to where he believed she had ended up. He shifted his stance slightly, glancing at his watch for just a second, not because he was in a hurry, but because the gesture reinforced the idea that his time was valuable, that this moment, this conversation, was a brief detour in a much larger, more important day. "I am heading out to New York," he added, almost casually. "Board meeting." The usual chaos. He gave a small shrug, as if managing high-stakes decisions was simply part of his routine, something effortless, expected. Then his eyes returned to her, scanning her once more, softer this time, almost reflective. "You look different," he said, choosing the word carefully, though it carried more weight than he allowed it to show. Different from the woman who used to orbit his world. Different from the version of her he had decided no longer fit into it. Evelyn's smile returned, just as quiet as before, but this time it held a trace of something deeper, something that did not reach for his approval or react to his tone. It simply existed, steady and self-contained. "So do you," she replied, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering. It was not a compliment. It was not an insult. It was an observation, delivered without emotion, without attachment. For a brief second, Ryan felt that same faint shift again, that subtle misalignment between what he expected and what was actually in front of him. It was small enough to ignore. So he did. Because in his mind, the story was already written. He had moved forward. He had built something bigger. And she, standing there with her simple coat and quiet presence, was just a reminder of a chapter he had already closed. What he did not see, what he could not yet understand, was that Evelyn Carter was not standing in his past. She was standing at the edge of something he had never been invited to. Ryan nodded once more, as if sealing the conversation in a neat, controlled box, but something about the way Evelyn stood there made it difficult for him to walk away immediately, as though leaving too quickly might expose a hesitation he did not want to acknowledge even to himself. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, a small, precise movement, the crisp fabric sliding under the tailored sleeve of his jacket, everything about him aligned. With the world he had built, a world measured in boardrooms, quarterly reports, and the quiet validation of being recognized wherever he went. "Well," he said, drawing the word out just slightly, "it was good to see you." The pause before the final phrase suggested obligation more than sincerity, a line delivered because it was expected, not because it was felt. Evelyn inclined her head just a fraction, acknowledging the statement without reinforcing it, her fingers resting lightly on the handle of her suitcase as if she had nowhere to rush and nothing to prove. Around them, the rhythm of the terminal continued, a choreography of motion and stillness, passengers passing through glass doors, attendants moving with practiced efficiency, the distant hum of engines vibrating faintly through the structure like a reminder of the world beyond the walls. Ryan shifted his weight again, preparing to turn, when a voice called out from behind him, bright and polished. "Ryan, there you are." He turned instinctively, his expression smoothing into something more open, more welcoming, the kind of reaction reserved for people who still belonged in his present. A woman approached, her heels clicking softly against the floor, her presence commanding attention without effort. Her name was Claire Montgomery, his fiancée, her blonde hair falling in soft waves over a tailored cream coat, her diamond earrings catching the light with every step. She carried herself with the ease of someone who had never needed to question her place in any room she entered. "I have been looking for you," she said, slipping her hand lightly through his arm, her gaze flicking briefly to Evelyn, curiosity sharpening her otherwise composed expression. Ryan offered a small smile, the kind that reassured without explaining. "Claire, this is Evelyn," he said, his tone casual, almost dismissive in its brevity. "We used to be married." The introduction landed with a quiet finality, reducing years of shared history into a single, contained fact. Claire's eyebrows lifted just slightly, a flicker of surprise quickly replaced by a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Of course," she said smoothly, her voice warm but measured. "I have heard about you." The words hovered between them, carefully neutral, though the implication beneath them was harder, sharper, shaped by second-hand stories and assumptions that had never been challenged. Evelyn met her gaze with the same calm steadiness she had shown. Ryan, offering a small nod in return. "I hope only the edited version," she replied, her tone light, almost conversational, but carrying a quiet precision that made Claire's smile tighten just a fraction. Ryan let out a short breath that could have been a laugh, though it lacked warmth. "Evelyn always had a sense of humor," he said, as if explaining her, as if placing her neatly back into a version of herself that made sense to him. Claire's hand tightened ever so slightly around his arm, a subtle claim, a reinforcement of the present standing beside him. "We are about to board," she said, glancing toward the commercial terminal entrance where a line had begun to form, passengers organizing themselves into categories of priority and timing. "They just announced pre-boarding." Ryan nodded, his attention shifting in that direction, already moving mentally into the next part of his day, the next room, the next conversation where everything would align exactly as he expected. He looked back at Evelyn one last time, his gaze softer now, almost reflective, as if granting her a final moment of acknowledgement. "Take care of yourself," he said, the words gentle on the surface, but carrying the quiet assumption that she would need to. Evelyn's smile did not change. "I always do," she replied. It was a simple sentence, but it did not sound like reassurance. It sounded like fact. Ryan hesitated for the briefest moment, something unspoken pressing against the edges of his certainty, but Claire was already guiding him forward, her presence pulling him back into the flow of his world. As they walked toward the boarding gate, the distance between them and Evelyn widened, swallowed by glass and light and movement. Behind them, she remained exactly where she was, still, composed, untouched by the quiet judgments that had just passed over her. And just beyond the polished boundary that separated commercial travel from something far more exclusive, a set of double doors slid open without a sound, revealing a corridor few people in that terminal would ever notice, let alone enter. Evelyn did not look back as she turned toward it, her steps measured, her expression unchanged, as if she had been walking in that direction all along. The corridor beyond the glass doors was quieter, almost unnaturally so, the ambient noise of the main terminal fading into a distant echo as Evelyn Carter stepped forward without hesitation, her pace steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had walked this path 100 times before and did not need to look around to confirm where she was going. The lighting shifted subtly here, softer, more deliberate, casting a warm sheen across the polished floors and the muted tones of the private terminal interior, where every detail felt curated rather than functional. A man in a tailored charcoal uniform approached her with measured steps, his expression professional yet unmistakably attentive, the kind of attention reserved for someone whose presence mattered. "Good afternoon, Miss Carter," he said, his voice low and respectful, as though even the air in this space required discretion. Evelyn gave a small nod, acknowledging him without breaking her stride. "Good afternoon," she replied, her tone calm, familiar, as if this exchange was part of a routine she no longer thought about. He fell into step beside her, not leading, not directing, but accompanying, his presence quiet but precise. "Your aircraft is prepared," he continued. "Departure is scheduled in approximately 20 minutes, but we can adjust as needed." The offer was made without hesitation, without conditions, the kind of flexibility that did not exist in the world just beyond the glass walls she had left behind. Evelyn's gaze remained forward, her expression composed. 20 minutes is fine, she said. "Has Mr. Hale arrived?" There was a slight pause, not of uncertainty, but of careful confirmation. "He is expected within the next 10 minutes, the attendant replied. He asked to be informed the moment you arrived." Evelyn inclined her head once more, a subtle acknowledgement that carried more weight than any extended conversation. Meanwhile, on the other side of the terminal, Ryan Whitmore stood in line at the commercial boarding gate, his attention drifting despite the structured environment around him, the organized announcements, the steady movement of passengers, the predictable rhythm of a world he understood completely. Claire stood beside him, scrolling through her phone, her expression composed, her posture perfect, every detail aligned with the image they projected together. "She seemed different," Claire said after a moment, her voice casual but edged with curiosity, her eyes lifting briefly to meet his. Ryan let out a soft breath, his gaze shifting toward the large windows that overlooked the runway, where private jets sat at a distance, sleek and untouchable. "People change," he replied. His tone dismissive, though not entirely convincing even to himself. "Sometimes not for the better." Claire studied him for a second longer than necessary, as if weighing whether there was more beneath his words, then let it go with a small nod, returning her attention to her phone. Ryan adjusted his stance, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as his eyes lingered on the far end of the tarmac, where a Gulfstream jet gleamed under the fading sunlight, its polished exterior reflecting the sky in shades of gold and steel. There was something about it that drew his attention, something he could not immediately place, a quiet pull that felt out of proportion with its distance. He exhaled slowly, shaking the thought away, grounding himself in the familiar structure of his surroundings, the boarding groups being called, the clear hierarchy of movement, the assurance that everything was unfolding exactly as it should. Back in the private terminal, Evelyn stepped through a final set of doors that opened seamlessly at her approach, revealing the aircraft up close, its scale more imposing from this angle, its presence less like transportation and more like a statement. The air carried a faint scent of jet fuel mixed with something cleaner, sharper, the signature of controlled luxury. She paused for just a moment at the base of the stairs, not to admire it, not to hesitate, but as if aligning herself with something internal, something far removed from the version of her that had once stood beside Ryan in rooms where she had felt invisible. Then, without looking back, she took the first step upward, her movements unhurried, her silhouette framed by the fading light, while somewhere behind layers of glass and distance, a man who believed he had already seen the full extent of her story stood unknowingly at the edge of a truth he had not yet begun to understand. The soft hum of the aircraft's interior wrapped around Evelyn Carter as she stepped inside, the temperature slightly cooler, the air filtered and still, carrying the faint scent of leather and polished wood, a quiet contrast to the distant chaos of the terminal she had just left behind. The cabin lights cast a warm, diffused glow across the wide seats and clean surfaces, everything arranged with an understated precision that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. She moved forward with calm familiarity. Placing her carry-on beside one of the seats without hesitation, her fingers brushing lightly against the armrest as if confirming its presence rather than discovering it. There was no sense of arrival in her expression, no visible shift from one world to another, only continuity, as though this space was not an upgrade, but simply an extension of where she already belonged. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long reflections across the aircraft's body, the runway shimmering faintly in the heat, while ground crew moved with quiet efficiency below, their actions coordinated, practiced, and precise. In the distance, beyond the restricted perimeter, commercial gates continued their steady cycle, passengers boarding in groups, announcements echoing through open spaces, the rhythm predictable and controlled. Ryan Whitmore stood near the boarding lane, his attention no longer anchored to Claire's quiet commentary or the movement of the line ahead of him, but pulled again toward the far end of the tarmac where the Gulf Stream remained, its presence now impossible for him to ignore. There was something about the timing, the positioning, the subtle activity around it that did not align with his expectations, a detail that refused to settle into the background like everything else. Ryan, Claire's voice cut through his thoughts, gentle but firm, bringing him back. They are calling Group 1. He blinked once, then nodded, stepping forward with her as the line advanced, his movements automatic, practiced, his body following a routine his mind had not fully returned to. Still, his gaze drifted once more toward the jet, catching a brief glimpse of motion near its base, a figure ascending the stairs, framed by light and shadow in a way that felt oddly deliberate. He could not see clearly from this distance, only the outline, the controlled pace, the absence of hesitation. It should not have mattered. It did not belong to his world, not directly. And yet, something in him resisted looking away. Inside the aircraft, Evelyn settled into her seat, her posture relaxed but composed, her hands resting lightly in her lap as she glanced toward the window, not searching, not waiting, simply observing. A member of the flight crew approached quietly, offering a glass of water with a small, respectful nod. "Miss Carter, welcome aboard," she said softly. Evelyn accepted the glass with a brief smile, the gesture effortless. "Thank you." There was no excess in the exchange. No need for it. Moments later, the cabin door remained open, the outside light shifting as another presence approached, footsteps measured, unhurried, carrying a weight that altered the atmosphere without a single word being spoken. The crew straightened subtly, their attention sharpening, not out of tension, but recognition. A man stepped into view, tall, composed, his presence defined not by display, but by quiet authority. Jonathan Hale. His gaze found Evelyn immediately, not searching, not surprised, but certain, as if this moment had been anticipated long before it arrived. "You made it," he said, his voice calm, grounded, carrying the kind of ease that came from never needing to prove anything. Evelyn met his eyes, her expression unchanged, but something in the stillness between them shifted, a silent understanding that required no explanation. "Right on time," she replied. Outside, far beyond the glass and distance that separated their worlds, Ryan Whitmore stepped onto the jet bridge, the door closing behind him as the line continued forward, sealing him into a path he believed he controlled. He did not see the moment the cabin door of the Gulfstream began to close. He did not hear the engines preparing to come alive. And he did not yet realize that the story he thought had ended years ago had only just begun to reveal itself. The cabin door sealed with a soft, definitive click that seemed to separate two entirely different realities, one fading quietly into the distance while the other settled into a stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, and absolute. Evelyn Carter did not turn her head when the engines began their low, steady hum, the vibration barely noticeable beneath her feet, a subtle reminder of movement before motion even began. Across from her, Jonathan Hale took his seat with the ease of someone who did not need to adjust himself to any space, because every space adjusted to him. He placed a slim leather portfolio on the table between them, his movements unhurried, his presence grounded in a way that made everything else feel almost secondary. "You handled that well," he said after a moment, his voice even, carrying no curiosity, only observation. Evelyn's fingers traced the rim of the glass in her hand, the condensation cool against her skin, her gaze still angled toward the window where the runway stretched into the horizon. "It did not require handling," she replied. Her tone calm, as if the encounter had been no more significant than a passing detail in a much larger day. Jonathan studied her for a brief second, not questioning, not probing, simply acknowledging the precision of her answer. "He still thinks you are part of his past," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet statement of fact. Evelyn allowed herself the smallest pause, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, layered over the fading outline of the terminal behind her. "That is where he left me," she said softly. "It makes sense that he believes I stayed there." The engines deepened in tone, the aircraft beginning its slow, controlled movement along the tarmac, each shift smooth, almost imperceptible, as if even acceleration had been refined into something elegant. Inside the commercial cabin, Ryan Whitmore settled into his seat near the window, the fabric firm, the space familiar, the environment structured in a way that required no thought. Claire sat beside him, already adjusting her tablet, her focus returning to schedules and messages, her world continuing exactly as expected. Ryan fastened his seatbelt with a practice motion, his gaze drifting once more to the window as the aircraft began to push back from the gate. The terminal moved slowly in reverse, glass and steel sliding past in measured frames, until the open runway came into view, wide and endless under the fading light. And then he saw it. The Gulf Stream. Closer now. Not distant. Not abstract. Real. Positioned at an angle that caught the last stretch of sunlight, its surface reflecting gold and shadow in sharp contrast. His eyes narrowed slightly, drawn to the movement around it, the ground crew stepping back, the final checks being completed. There was a moment, brief but distinct, when the aircraft door aligned perfectly with his line of sight, just before it sealed completely. He could not see inside. He could not confirm what part of him was reacting. But something about it felt and finished, like a sentence cut off before the final word. "You are thinking about her," Claire said quietly, not accusatory, but perceptive, her eyes still on her screen. Ryan exhaled, leaning back into his seat, his jaw tightening just enough to register tension. "No," he said, a fraction too quickly. "I am thinking about timing." It was not entirely untrue. But it was not the truth. Outside. The private jet began to taxi, its movement smooth, controlled, unhurried, as if it operated on a different rhythm than everything around it. Inside, Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in exhaustion, not in reflection, but in alignment, as though she were settling fully into a version of herself that required no explanation and no validation. Across from her, Jonathan opened the portfolio, a set of documents visible for only a second before he closed it again, his attention returning to her. "Once we land," he said, "they will expect you to make the final call." Evelyn opened her eyes, her gaze steady, clear, untouched by hesitation. "Then we will not keep them waiting," she replied. The aircraft turned toward the runway, engines building with quiet power, the world outside shifting into motion. And somewhere behind them, in a different cabin, on a different path, a man who believed he understood the direction of every story in his life was about to discover that this one had never been his to define. The aircraft surged forward with a smooth, controlled force, the engines deepening into a steady roar that never quite broke the calm inside the cabin, as if even speed had been refined into something deliberate, something measured. Evelyn Carter did not grip the armrest, did not brace herself, her posture unchanged as the runway blurred into motion outside the window, the ground slipping away in long, stretched lines of light and shadow. Across from her, Jonathan Hale remained equally composed, his attention not on the takeoff, but on her, as though the ascent of the aircraft was secondary to something far more significant unfolding within the quiet space between them. "They will expect resistance," he said, his tone calm, precise, each word placed carefully. "Not everyone will be comfortable with the decision." Evelyn's gaze remained forward, the horizon tilting slightly as the jet lifted into the air, the city below shrinking into a grid of lights and structure, everything reduced to something distant, manageable, small. "They rarely are," she replied, her voice steady, untouched by concern. "That has never changed the outcome." Jonathan gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in recognition, as if confirming something he had already known long before this moment. "No," he said quietly. "It has not." Thousands of feet below, another aircraft moved along the same stretch of sky. Separated by altitude, by trajectory, by intention. Inside the commercial cabin, Ryan Whitmore felt the familiar pull of ascent press lightly against him, the engines louder here, less refined, the vibration more present, more grounded in reality. He glanced out the window as the city fell away beneath them, his reflection faint against the glass, layered over the fading landscape. For a brief moment, his mind drifted back to the terminal, to the image of Evelyn standing there, composed, unaffected, her presence lingering in a way that did not align with the version of her he had carried for years. It unsettled him, though he would not have used that word. He shifted in his seat, adjusting his jacket slightly, grounding himself in the familiar structure of his surroundings, the predictable rhythm of a flight he had taken countless times before. Beside him, Claire continued scrolling, her world uninterrupted, her focus anchored in schedules and plans that extended neatly into the future. "You are quiet," she said without looking up, her tone neutral, observational. Ryan exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to the clouds now stretching endlessly outside the window. "Just thinking about the meeting," he replied, his voice controlled, measured. It was the kind of answer that required no follow-up, the kind that closed a door without appearing to. Claire nodded faintly, accepting it without question, her attention already shifting elsewhere. High above them, the Gulf Stream leveled out, the cabin settling into a stillness that felt almost suspended in time. Evelyn leaned back slightly, her eyes closing for a brief second, not in fatigue, but in quiet clarity, as if aligning herself fully with the path ahead. When she opened them again, her gaze was sharper, more defined, focused not on where she had been, but on what was waiting. Jonathan slid a single document across the table toward her, the paper crisp, the details precise, though she did not look down at it immediately. "This is the final confirmation," he said. "Once you sign, there is no reversal." Evelyn's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the document, her touch steady, deliberate. Outside, the clouds stretched in endless layers, soft and distant, concealing everything below, separating past from present in a way that felt almost symbolic. "There was never going to be one," she said quietly. She picked up the pen, her movements unhurried, and signed her name with a single, fluid motion. Jonathan watched her for a moment, then allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile, not of surprise, but of certainty fulfilled. "Then it is done," he said. Evelyn set the pen down, her expression unchanged, her gaze lifting once more toward the window, toward the horizon that continued to stretch forward without end. Somewhere far below, in a different aircraft moving along a parallel path, Ryan Whitmore sat unaware that with the stroke of that pen, something fundamental had shifted, something that would soon intersect with his world in a way he could not anticipate. And for the first time, the distance between what he believed and what was true was no longer measured in years. It was measured in moments. The silence after the signature did not feel empty, it felt settled, like something long in motion had finally reached its intended destination without needing to announce it. Evelyn Carter withdrew her hand from the document, her fingers still, composed, as if the weight of what she had just finalized did not need to be expressed through movement. Across from her, Jonathan Hale closed the folder with quiet precision, the soft click of leather against paper marking an end that did not require emphasis. "By the time we land," he said, his tone even, "the board will have already received the notice." Evelyn nodded once, her gaze drifting back to the window where the clouds stretched in endless layers, soft and impenetrable, hiding everything below, including the version of her life that no longer existed. "They will not believe it at first," she said. It was not doubt. It was observation. Jonathan allowed the faintest trace of a smile. "They do not need to believe it," he replied. "They will need to respond to it." Several thousand feet below, in a cabin that felt more confined despite its familiarity, Ryan Whitmore shifted slightly in his seat as the seatbelt sign dimmed, the subtle chime signaling a return to routine, to movement, to the small freedoms within controlled space. Passengers around him adjusted, reaching for bags, stretching, resuming conversations that had been paused for takeoff. The world was continuing exactly as expected. And yet, something in him remained unsettled, like a thought that refused to fully form. He glanced again at his reflection in the window, the outline of his face layered over the sky. And for a brief moment, Evelyn's image overlapped with it in his mind, not as she had been, but as she had stood in the terminal, calm, unmoved, almost distant. It did not align. It did not fit the narrative he had built. "You are still thinking," Claire said, setting her tablet aside, her attention now fully on him, her tone light but edged with quiet curiosity. Ryan exhaled through his nose, leaning back slightly, his gaze shifting away from the window. I am thinking about perception, he said, choosing the word carefully, as if naming it would make it easier to dismiss. Claire tilted her head slightly. That sounds unusually philosophical for you, she said with a small, amused smile. Ryan did not return it. People tend to believe what is easiest, he continued, more to himself than to her. It saves time. Claire studied him for a second, then nodded, accepting the statement without pressing further, though something in her expression suggested she was beginning to notice the shift in him, however subtle it might be. High above, the Gulf Stream maintained its course with effortless precision, the cabin untouched by turbulence, the environment so controlled it almost felt detached from reality. Evelyn remained still, her posture relaxed but deliberate, her presence anchored in a way that did not seek validation from anything outside of herself. The past, once heavy and consuming, now existed as something distant, reduced, almost irrelevant. Jonathan leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze steady on her. You never asked what changed their minds, he said after a moment, his tone neutral, but carrying a quiet curiosity. Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not amused, but knowing. They did not change their minds, she replied. They ran out of options. The answer hung in the air, simple, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, a horizon without boundaries, a path forward that did not require permission. Somewhere below, Ryan Whitmore sat unaware that the assumptions he had carried for years were already unraveling, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through something far more definitive. Reality. And for the first time, the distance between what he believed and what was true was no longer protected by time or silence. It was closing, quietly, inevitably, with every mile that brought their worlds closer together. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft continued its steady path through the sky, the outside world reduced to a vast expanse of pale blue and drifting clouds, everything distant, everything quiet, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the weight of what had already been set in motion. Evelyn Carter remained still, her gaze resting on the horizon, her expression composed in a way that no longer carried traces of the woman who once measured her worth through someone else's approval. Across from her, Jonathan Hale watched her with a quiet attentiveness, not intrusive, not questioning, but aware, as though he understood that this moment was not about what had been decided, but about what was about to unfold. They will try to reach you before we land, he said after a moment, his voice low, steady, each word deliberate. Calls, messages, requests for clarification. Evelyn did not look at him immediately, her fingers resting lightly against the armrest, her posture relaxed yet grounded. They will not get through, she replied, her tone calm, not dismissive, but certain. Jonathan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the finality in her voice. No, he said. They will not. Far below, the commercial aircraft cut through the same sky, its path parallel yet entirely separate, carrying passengers who remained unaware of the quiet shifts happening beyond their reach. Inside, Ryan Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting against his knees, his fingers loosely interlocked as his gaze drifted downward, though there was nothing to see beyond layers of cloud. The unease that had settled in him earlier had not faded. It had sharpened. Not enough to name. Not enough to confront. But enough to linger. He reached for his phone, more out of habit than intention, scrolling through emails, updates, confirmations, each message reinforcing the structure of the world he operated in. Everything was in place. Everything was moving forward. And yet, the image of Evelyn remained, not as a memory, but as a disruption. Claire glanced at him from the corner of her eye, her posture still composed, but her attention no longer divided. You are not preparing for the meeting, she said, her tone observational, not accusatory, but precise. Ryan did not look up immediately, his thumb pausing against the screen. I know what I am walking into, he replied, his voice controlled, even. Claire studied him for a moment, then leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. You always do, she said softly. That is what makes this different. The word settled between them, subtle, but pointed, as if she had recognized something he had not yet allowed himself to admit. High above, the Gulf Stream began its gradual descent, the shift so smooth it barely registered, the horizon tilting almost imperceptibly as the aircraft adjusted its course. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, not to rest, but to center herself, her breath steady, her mind clear, untouched by hesitation or doubt. When she opened them again, there was no trace of the past in her gaze, no shadow of what had been lost or taken. Only direction. Jonathan glanced at the display panel, confirming their approach, then returned his attention to her. "Once we land, there will be no delay," he said. "They are already waiting." Evelyn nodded once, her movements minimal, precise. "They have been waiting longer than they realize," she replied. Outside, the clouds began to break, revealing the city below in sharp, defined lines, buildings rising with purpose, streets intersecting with intention, a world built on power, perception, and decisions that shaped everything beneath them. Somewhere within that city, Ryan Whitmore's world continued to move forward, structured, predictable, anchored in the belief that he understood its direction. What he did not yet see, what he could not yet anticipate, was that Evelyn Carter was no longer approaching that world as someone who had once belonged to it. She was arriving as someone who was about to redefine it. And when their paths crossed again, it would not be a coincidence. It would be inevitable. The wheels touched the runway with a controlled, almost imperceptible impact, the kind that did not jolt but settled, as if the aircraft had simply chosen to return to the ground rather than being forced onto it. Evelyn Carter did not shift in her seat, her gaze steady as the city rose to meet them through the window, no longer distant, no longer abstract, but real, structured, waiting. The engine softened as the jet slowed, the momentum easing into stillness, every movement precise, intentional, without excess. Across from her, Jonathan Hale closed the remaining documents with quiet finality, his posture unchanged, his attention already moving ahead to what came next. "They are already in position," he said, his voice calm, each word measured. "Press, board members, legal representatives. They will all be there." Evelyn nodded once, her expression unchanged, as if the weight of an entire room full of expectation did not reach her. "Then we will not disappoint them," she replied. Outside, the aircraft taxied smoothly across the tarmac, guided toward a section of the airport set apart from the usual traffic, a space defined not by volume, but by exclusivity. Black vehicles were already aligned near the private terminal, their presence understated but unmistakable, each detail signaling preparation, anticipation, control. Several thousand feet away and minutes behind, Ryan Whitmore's flight descended along a separate approach, the cabin filling with the soft chime of seatbelt reminders and the quiet shift of passengers preparing for arrival. He glanced out the window as the city came into view, sharp lines of glass and steel reflecting the late afternoon light, a skyline he knew well, a place where his influence carried weight, where his name opened doors without question. It grounded him, re-established the certainty that had been momentarily unsettled. "Back to reality," Claire said lightly, adjusting her coat as she glanced toward the window, her tone carrying a quiet satisfaction, as if returning here meant returning to control. Ryan allowed a faint smile, though it did not fully reach his eyes. "It never left," he replied, his voice steady, but something beneath it remained unresolved, a thread he could not quite trace. The aircraft slowed, aligning with the gate, the routine unfolding exactly as expected, each step predictable, structured, familiar. And yet, as he stepped off the plane moments later, the air in the terminal felt different, not in temperature, not in sound, but in something less tangible, something that pressed lightly against his awareness without explanation. His phone vibrated once in his hand. Then again. And again. He frowned slightly, glancing down at the screen. Multiple notifications. Messages from colleagues. From assistants. From numbers he recognized and some he did not. The subject lines were short, urgent, inconsistent. "Have you seen this? Call me immediately. Board update just dropped." His brow tightened as he slowed his pace, Claire stopping beside him, her expression shifting from casual composure to quiet concern as she noticed the change in his demeanor. "What is it?" she asked, her voice lower now, more focused. Ryan did not answer immediately. He opened one of the messages, his eyes scanning the text quickly. Then again, slower this time, as if the meaning required confirmation. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in something closer to disbelief. "That is not possible," he said under his breath, though no one had asked the question yet. Claire stepped closer, her gaze flicking to his screen, her posture straightening. "Ryan," she said softly, "what happened?" He did not respond right away. Instead, he lifted his eyes, almost instinctively, toward the far end of the terminal, toward the glass that separated this world from another he had only glimpsed from a distance hours earlier. Outside, just beyond that invisible boundary, a sleek black car door closed with quiet precision as Evelyn Carter stepped onto the pavement, her movements unhurried, her presence immediately recognized by the people waiting for her. Cameras shifted. Heads turned. Not in confusion. Not in curiosity. In acknowledgement. Ryan's grip on his phone tightened slightly as the realization began to form, not fully, not completely, but enough to fracture the certainty he had carried all day. Because for the first time, the story he believed was no longer aligning with what was unfolding in front of him. And this time, he was not the one in control of how it ended. The glass doors parted with a quiet, seamless motion, and the moment Evelyn Carter stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted in a way that could not be explained by sound or movement alone, but by recognition, immediate and undeniable. Conversations lowered without instruction, heads turned not in curiosity, but in awareness, as if the room had already been prepared for her arrival long before she entered it. The lobby of the private terminal was no longer just a space of transit, it had become a stage, though she did not perform, and that was precisely what made it powerful. Cameras adjusted with soft mechanical clicks, lenses focusing, capturing, documenting, but Evelyn did not acknowledge them, her gaze steady, her pace unhurried, her presence untouched by the attention surrounding her. Jonathan Hale walked half a step behind her, not leading, not announcing, but reinforcing something far more significant than introduction. He did not need to say who she was. The room already knew. Outside, through the wide glass panels, the last light of the afternoon reflected off the aircraft she had just stepped down from, its presence now contextualized, no longer a distant symbol of wealth, but a direct extension of her reality. Across the terminal, beyond the controlled separation of spaces, Ryan Whitmore stood still, his phone still in his hand, though he was no longer looking at it. The messages, the alerts, the fragmented explanations, they all blurred into something secondary compared to what was unfolding in front of him. Claire followed his line of sight, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly as she took in the scene, the cameras, the people, the unmistakable shift in attention that centered on a single figure. "Ryan," she said quietly, her voice edged with something new, something closer to unease. "Why is everyone looking at her?" He did not answer immediately. He could not. Because for the first time, the version of Evelyn Carter he had constructed in his mind had nowhere to exist within what he was seeing. She moved through the room with a quiet authority that did not demand space, but received it without resistance. A man in a dark suit stepped forward, his posture formal, his expression respectful. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice clear, carrying just enough volume to reach those who needed to hear it. "The board is ready for you." The word settled into the air with weight, with clarity, with finality. Not a question. Not a request. A confirmation. Claire's grip on Ryan's arm tightened slightly, her composure fracturing just enough to reveal the shift beneath it. "The board," she repeated softly, her eyes flicking between Ryan and Evelyn, searching for an explanation that did not come. Ryan's jaw tightened, his gaze locked on Evelyn, his mind moving rapidly, trying to reconcile fragments of information that refused to align. He glanced down at his phone again, opening one of the messages he had not fully processed before, his eyes scanning the headline that now felt impossible to ignore. Major acquisition finalized, controlling stake transferred, new principal decision maker. His breath slowed, not in calm, but in realization, the pieces beginning to connect in a way that left no room for denial. Evelyn paused briefly as the man spoke, not to consider, not to hesitate, but to acknowledge. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm, steady, as if stepping into a room full of executives waiting for her decision was no more significant than any other part of her day. She did not look toward Ryan. She did not need to. The distance between them was no longer physical. It was defined by everything he had failed to see. As she continued forward, the room adjusted around her, not dramatically, not obviously, but undeniably. And in that moment, standing just beyond the boundary of a world he believed he understood, Ryan Whitmore realized something that no message, no report, no explanation could soften. He had not been watching her fall. He had been watching her rise. And he had not even known when it began. The doors to the boardroom closed with a soft, controlled sound that seemed to seal the moment behind Evelyn Carter, separating her entirely from the world Ryan Whitmore was still standing in, a world that suddenly felt smaller, narrower, less certain than it had just minutes before. Inside, the air was cool and measured, the long polished table surrounded by executives whose names carried weight in industries that shaped markets, decisions, and reputations. They were already seated, already waiting, their attention fixed on the woman who had just entered, not with curiosity, but with expectation. Evelyn did not pause at the threshold. She walked forward with the same unhurried precision, her posture straight, her presence steady, as if she had always belonged in rooms like this, as if there had never been a version of her life where she stood outside of it. Jonathan Hale moved to his place without drawing attention, his role now clearly defined not as the center of power, but as part of the structure surrounding it. At the head of the table, a chair remained empty. Not reserved. Not symbolic. Simply waiting. Evelyn reached it without hesitation and took her seat, the motion smooth, deliberate, final. No one spoke immediately. They did not need to. The silence itself acknowledged the shift that had already taken place. A man seated halfway down the table adjusted his glasses, his voice measured as he broke the quiet. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone respectful, but edged with the weight of what had been set in motion. "Before we proceed, we would like to confirm that you intend to exercise full control over the acquisition." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression composed, her eyes steady, revealing nothing beyond certainty. "There is nothing to confirm," she replied. "It has already been executed." The words landed without force, but they did not need it. Around the table, subtle shifts occurred, shoulders straightening, glances exchanged, not in opposition, but in recalibration, as if each person present was adjusting their understanding of where authority now resided. Outside, beyond layers of glass and distance, Ryan Whitmore remained where he was, though the flow of the terminal had resumed around him, people moving, conversations continuing, the world refusing to pause for his realization. Claire stood beside him, her composure returning in measured increments, though her eyes remained fixed in the direction Evelyn had disappeared. "Ryan," she said quietly, her voice no longer uncertain, but focused. "Tell me what is happening." He did not look at her immediately. His gaze remained locked on the closed doors of the private terminal, as if they might open again and undo what he had just witnessed. He began, then stopped, the word incomplete, insufficient. He exhaled slowly, forcing the thought into something coherent. "She just took control of a company we have been trying to acquire for the last 8 months. Claire's expression stilled completely, the implication settling in with quiet precision. "That is not possible," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, his grip on his phone firm now, no longer casual. "It is," he replied, his voice low, grounded not in acceptance, but in the absence of any other explanation. Inside the boardroom, Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly against the table, her presence now fully anchored in the position she had claimed. "We will move forward immediately," she said, her voice calm, controlled, carrying across the room with effortless authority. "All existing negotiations are to be restructured under the new terms. There will be no delays. No one interrupted. No one questioned. Not because they lacked opinions, but because the decision had already been made before they had the chance to voice them." Jonathan observed the room quietly, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged, as if this outcome had always been inevitable. Outside, Ryan Whitmore finally looked away from the doors, his eyes dropping briefly to the floor before lifting again, not toward Evelyn, not toward the past, but toward something he had not yet defined. For the first time, the certainty that had shaped his decisions, his confidence, his understanding of control, felt incomplete. Not broken, but no longer absolute. And somewhere beyond the walls that separated them, Evelyn Carter sat at the head of a table he had spent months trying to reach, making decisions that would ripple through his world in ways he could no longer predict. She did not need to confront him. She did not need to explain anything. Because in the quiet, measured way she had stepped into power, she had already answered the only question that mattered. The boardroom settled into a rhythm that no longer needed to prove itself, decisions moving forward with a quiet precision that reflected the woman at the head of the table, every voice measured, every response aligned, not out of obligation, but out of recognition of where authority now lived. Evelyn Carter did not raise her voice, did not repeat herself, did not seek agreement, and yet every directive she gave carried through the room with a finality that left no space for hesitation. When the last document was reviewed and the final confirmation was acknowledged, she rose from her seat with the same calm control she had maintained since the moment she entered, the meeting ending not with applause or declaration, but with a subtle shift in posture from everyone present, as if the room itself understood that something irreversible had just been completed. Jonathan Hale stepped forward beside her as the others began to gather their materials, their movements respectful, deliberate, their attention no longer questioning, but recalibrated. "They will adjust quickly," he said quietly as they walked toward the door. Evelyn did not slow her pace. "They always do," she replied. The doors opened again, returning her to the open space of the terminal, where the energy had changed, less anticipatory now, more aware, as if the story had already moved past speculation and into reality. Outside, the line between public and private space remained, invisible but absolute, and on the other side of it, Ryan Whitmore still stood, though the confidence that had once defined his posture had shifted into something quieter, something more uncertain, as if he were standing in a place he recognized but no longer fully understood. Claire remained beside him, her composure restored on the surface, though her gaze continued to follow Evelyn's movement with a focus that had lost its earlier detachment. This time, when Evelyn stepped forward, she did not pass through unnoticed. The distance between them closed, not physically, but in awareness, in the undeniable fact that they now occupied the same moment, the same reality, without the illusion that had once separated them. Ryan took a step forward before he fully realized he had made the decision to move, his voice catching slightly before settling into something controlled. "Evelyn." Her name left his mouth differently now, stripped of assumption, grounded in something closer to recognition. She stopped, not abruptly, not reluctantly, but with intention, turning to face him with the same calm expression she had carried from the beginning. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the terminal softened again, the movement around them continuing, but distant, secondary, as if the space between them had narrowed into something singular. Ryan exhaled slowly, searching for words that no longer felt sufficient, the questions he might have asked earlier now irrelevant, replaced by something simpler, more honest. "I did not know," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, not defensive, not demanding, but acknowledging. Evelyn held his gaze, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. "No," she replied. "You did not." There was no accusation in her tone, no trace of resentment, only clarity, as if she were stating something that had already been resolved long before this moment. Claire watched from just behind him, silent now, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful stillness, her understanding shifting without needing explanation. Ryan nodded once, the motion small, almost imperceptible, as if accepting something he could not undo. "You built all of this," he said, not as a question, but as a realization spoken out loud. Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not triumphant, not indulgent, but quiet, grounded. "I built what I needed," she said. The answer did not elaborate. It did not need to. Jonathan stepped forward slightly, his presence a subtle reminder of time, of movement, of what lay ahead. Evelyn inclined her head once toward Ryan, not in dismissal, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement, then turned away, her path already set, her direction unchanged. As she moved forward, the space opened for her without resistance, the world adjusting not because she demanded it, but because she no longer needed to. Ryan remained where he was, watching her go, not with regret, not entirely, but with a clarity that had come too late to change anything. The version of her he had once known no longer existed. And the version that stood before him now had never needed his recognition to become who she was. He had thought her story ended when she left his life. He had never considered that it had only just begun. And as Evelyn Carter walked forward without looking back, the final truth settled quietly into place. She had not returned to prove anything. She had arrived because she no longer had to.